Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the glittering blue waters of the ancient Mediterranean, to an island kingdom filled with painted palaces, dangerous seas, sacred bowls, and whispers of gods hidden beneath volcanic smoke. Tonight, we travel to Crete, home of the mysterious Minoan civilization. A civilization so advanced that later Greeks could barely believe it had once been real. They imagined labyrinths beneath the earth. They spoke of kings who ruled beside monsters. They told stories of a beast with the head of a bull waiting in darkness, while young victims trembled in endless corridors of stone. But long before those myths appeared, real people lived there. They traded gold across oceans. They danced in candlelight beside towering columns painted red as blood. And slowly, almost quietly at first, their entire world began to collapse. So dim the lights, settle into bed, maybe leave a little rain playing softly in the background, and let us drift together into the ancient Bronze Age world, where the sea smelled of salt and olive oil, where ships ruled the horizon, and where one island civilization stood unknowingly at the edge of disaster. The year was somewhere around 1620 BC, though nobody living on Crete would have counted time that way. The people of the island measured life through harvests, storms, births, funerals, and the return of merchant ships. The island itself felt alive. Warm winds moved through the hills, carrying the scent of herbs and distant seawater. Goats climbed rocky cliffs, while farmers worked terraces carved into the mountainsides. Small villages dotted the countryside, connected by roads surprisingly sophisticated for the age. Yet, all roads eventually led toward the great palaces. Among them stood the mighty palace of Knossos, enormous and confusing even to those who lived nearby. To outsiders arriving from Egypt or the Levant, it must have seemed impossible. Multi-story buildings rose above sprawling courtyards. Bright murals covered the walls with images of dolphins, lilies, acrobats, and noblewomen wearing elaborate dresses. Storage rooms held giant clay jars packed with grain, wine, honey, and oil. Skilled workers hammered bronze tools, while scribes pressed symbols into wet clay tablets. In one crowded district near the palace lived a young potter named Terenos. He was neither rich nor important. His hands were usually stained with clay, and his small workshop smelled constantly of smoke from the kiln. Every morning before sunrise, he carried buckets of water from a nearby cistern while the city slowly awakened around him. Bakers prepared barley bread. Fishermen returned from dark waters. Palace servants swept dust from stone corridors before officials appeared. Terenos preferred ordinary life. He did not care much about politics or religion. What fascinated him were ships. From the harbor, he watched foreign vessels arrive carrying strange fabrics, ivory carvings, copper ingots, and stories from lands beyond imagination. The sailors spoke languages he could not understand. Some came from ancient Egypt with shaved heads and painted eyes. Others arrived from distant coastal kingdoms far eastward, where cities rose beside deserts and rivers. the Minoans dominated much of this maritime world. Their ships moved confidently across the Mediterranean like seabirds gliding over calm waves. Trade made Crete wealthy. Wealth created beauty. Beauty created pride. And pride often hides danger. One evening, Terenos carried finished pottery toward a merchant district near the harbor. The setting sun painted the sea gold while musicians performed in the streets. Noble families passed by wearing jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli. Priests burned incense near shrines decorated with sacred horns. The island seemed untouchable. Then the earth trembled. At first, it felt like a cart rumbling across stone. Cups rattled gently. Birds exploded into the sky. People paused, but did not panic. Earthquakes were not uncommon on Crete. The island rested in a restless region where the ground often shifted. But this tremor lasted longer. Walls groaned softly. Somewhere nearby, a woman screamed. Terenos dropped one of his ceramic jars as the street lurched beneath him. The vessel shattered instantly. Dust drifted from rooftops, while dogs barked wildly across the city. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the shaking stopped. An uneasy silence followed. People stared at one another nervously. A priest standing near a shrine raised his hands toward the heavens and shouted that the earth goddess was angry. Others muttered prayers. Merchants crossed themselves with sacred gestures meant to ward off evil. By nightfall, most people tried, convincing themselves the danger had passed. It had not. Far to the north, beyond the horizon, the volcanic island now called Santorini had already begun its catastrophic awakening. At the time, the island was known as Thera. It was beautiful beyond description. White cliffs surrounded a thriving settlement filled with artists and traders closely connected to Crete. Minoan influence stretched there strongly. Frescoes painted on walls showed ships, festivals, monkeys, flowers, and elegant towns rising beside the sea. Deep beneath Thera, pressure had been building for generations. Nobody understood what truly slept under the earth. Weeks passed after the first tremors. Life continued cautiously across Crete. Terenos repaired damaged pottery and helped reinforce parts of his workshop. More earthquakes arrived intermittently, some weak, others violent enough to knock objects from shelves. Priests performed ceremonies almost daily now. Bulls were sacrificed. Wine poured across temple floors. Smoke rose constantly into the skies. Rumors spread through marketplaces. Fishermen claimed the sea had behaved strangely. One sailor swore he saw black smoke rising faintly from the northern horizon. Others laughed at him. Then came the ash. It arrived lightly at first, drifting invisibly through upper winds before settling over parts of the island like gray dust. Children pointed upward in confusion. Farmers rubbed strange powder between their fingers. Some believed it was a sign from the gods. Others feared plague. Terenos noticed the sunlight changing. Even during midday, the world sometimes appeared dimmer, as though a veil covered the heavens. The palace officials tried maintaining order. Messengers traveled constantly between settlements. Ships arrived carrying alarming news from Thera. Parts of the island had suffered severe destruction. Earthquakes had damaged buildings. Strange explosions echoed from the mountain. Still, few imagined the scale of what was coming. On the night disaster truly began, Terenos could not sleep. Warm wind moved through the city, carrying an odd sulfur smell. Dogs whined continuously. Somewhere in the darkness, temple drums echoed from the palace complex. Then the horizon flashed. For one impossible moment, the northern sky turned white. Not lightning, something larger. Moments later came a distant roar, unlike anything human ears were meant to hear. It rolled across the sea like the voice of the world itself. Windows rattled violently. People rushed from homes screaming in confusion. Terenos climbed toward a hillside overlooking the harbor. Far away beyond the black waters, a towering column rose into the heavens. Fire, smoke, ash, the eruption of Thera had begun in full fury. Even from Crete, the sight was terrifying. The volcanic plume climbed higher and higher until it blotted stars from the sky. Lightning crackled inside the cloud. Ash drifted through the air like dark snow. Panic spread rapidly. Priests declared the gods were waging war. Some people fell to their knees crying. Others fled toward temples, seeking protection. The eruption continued through the night. Explosions thundered repeatedly across the sea. By dawn, daylight barely penetrated the ash-filled atmosphere. Fine gray dust coated rooftops, crops, roads, and water basins. Yet the worst danger still moved unseen across the sea itself. When part of Thera collapsed into the ocean, enormous waves formed instantly. Tsunamis, walls of water, raced outward through the Aegean. Along Crete's northern coastline, fishermen noticed the sea withdrawing unnaturally far from shore. Boats tilted awkwardly against exposed rocks. Curious villagers wandered onto wet sand to inspect stranded fish flopping helplessly. Then someone pointed toward the horizon. A dark line stretched across the sea, growing larger. Faster, people began running. The wave struck with monstrous force. Harbors vanished instantly beneath churning water. Ships smashed against buildings like toys. Warehouses exploded into splinters. Entire coastal districts disappeared beneath roaring black waves, carrying debris, bodies, and shattered timber inland. At the harbor below Knossos, chaos consumed everything. Terenos watched in horror from elevated ground as the sea destroyed the lower port. Merchant vessels crashed together violently before being swept inland. Screams vanished beneath thunderous water. Fires ignited where oil stores ruptured. The Minoan fleet, pride of the civilization, was devastated within hours, and without ships, Crete's power weakened catastrophically. Ash continued falling for days. Fields suffered heavily. Trade routes collapsed. Fear poisoned daily life. Earthquakes persisted. Many believed the gods had abandoned them completely. Inside the palaces, officials struggled desperately to maintain control. Food inventories were counted obsessively. Messengers brought grim reports from across the island. Entire coastal settlements had vanished. Ports were unusable. Some villages faced starvation already. Terenos joined teams, helping recover survivors near the ruined harbor. Bodies washed ashore continuously. The smell of salt water mixed with death lingered everywhere. Survivors wandered through wreckage, searching for relatives. One afternoon, he discovered a child sitting silently beside a broken fishing boat lodged atop a collapsed building. The boy stared blankly toward the sea without speaking. Ash covered his hair completely, making him look almost like a stone statue. Terenos offered him water. The child finally whispered only one sentence. The sea tried to eat us. Months passed beneath a sky that often remained hazy and strange. Crops failed in several regions. Trade with foreign kingdoms slowed dramatically. Pirates and opportunistic raiders began attacking weakened shipping routes. Confidence in palace authority eroded steadily. Still, the civilization did not die immediately. That is the strange thing about collapse. It rarely arrives all at once. Instead, it seeps quietly into cracks, already forming beneath the surface. And on Crete, those cracks were spreading wider every year. The child's words stayed with Terenos long after the ruined harbor fell silent again. The sea tried to eat us. At night, when winds moved through broken warehouses and damaged docks, he could almost believe it himself. The Mediterranean no longer felt like the friendly, glittering highway that had once carried wealth into Crete. Now, the water seemed alive with hunger. Fishermen sailed reluctantly. Merchants argued constantly about risk. Sailors whispered prayers before even short journeys along the coast. And above all of it lingered the memory of the black northern sky. Months after the great eruption, life in Knossos continued in an uneasy rhythm. The palace still stood magnificent from a distance, its painted columns and sprawling courtyards projecting strength to anyone arriving inland. But beneath that appearance, tension poisoned nearly every corridor. The storage rooms no longer overflowed the way they once had. Officials carefully measured grain supplies. Olive oil shipments had dropped badly. Bronze imports from overseas became irregular. Entire trade agreements vanished when foreign ports failed to respond. The world beyond Crete was struggling too. In the pottery district, Terenos found fewer buyers each week. Wealthy nobles still commissioned decorative vessels for rituals and feasts, but ordinary people spent cautiously now. Survival mattered more than beauty. More families repaired cracked pottery instead of replacing it. One cold morning, Terenos walked through the marketplace, carrying a stack of freshly fired cups balanced carefully in a rope basket. The market had once been loud with music and shouting merchants from distant lands. Now entire rows sat half empty. Foreign accents had become rare. Even the smell felt different. Less spice, less wine, more smoke. A group of farmers argued near a grain cellar. The harvest failed because the ash poisoned the soil. One man insisted. No, another snapped back. The priests angered the gods. An old woman interrupted both of them. The earth itself is sick. Nobody laughed at her. That frightened Terenos more than anything. Before the disaster, people would have mocked such superstition openly. The Minoans had been confident people, skilled engineers, sailors, builders, traders. They believed their civilization sat at the center of the civilized world. Now fear infected every conversation, and fear changes societies faster than armies. Near the palace entrance, workers repaired cracked walls damaged by continuing earthquakes. Some sections had collapsed entirely during recent tremors. The ground still shook often enough to keep everyone nervous. Sleeping indoors had become difficult for many families. Some preferred temporary shelters outside the city rather than risk being crushed beneath falling stone. At the same time, priests gained increasing influence. Ceremonies multiplied across Crete. Sacred horns appeared outside homes. Animal sacrifices became larger and more frequent. Processions carrying offerings wound through the streets at dusk, while incense smoke drifted upward into darkening skies. The palace rulers encouraged these rituals, not because they necessarily believed every warning from the priesthood, but because frightened populations needed certainty. Religion provided answers when reality no longer did. One evening, Terenos delivered ceramic oil lamps to a palace servant named Melina, a woman he had known since childhood. She worked within the royal storage chambers, recording inventories onto clay tablets. Before the disaster, she had always spoken quickly and laughed often. Now she seemed exhausted. There's less grain again, she whispered quietly, while leading him through a corridor lined with faded murals. How bad? She hesitated. They're hiding the real numbers. Terenos looked toward nearby guards before lowering his voice. Why? Because panic would spread. The palace corridors smelled strongly of damp stone and olive oil. Servants moved constantly carrying baskets, tablets, and water jars. Yet beneath the activity, anxiety pulsed everywhere. People spoke in hushed voices. Messengers arrived at all hours. Officials argued behind closed doors. Melina stopped beside a narrow window, overlooking the western courtyards. Ships from the mainland have become aggressive, she said softly. Some refuse our authority now, Terenos frowned. Aggressive how? They demand more for trade. Some threaten raids. The mainland, that word alone, carried growing tension. Across the sea, the warrior kingdoms of Mycenaean Greece had been watching Crete carefully for years. Unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans admired warfare openly. Their cities were heavily fortified. Their rulers celebrated military power. Their graves overflowed with weapons and armor. Before the disaster, Minoan naval dominance kept such rivals cautious. But now the great fleets lay shattered beneath the sea. Predators notice weakness quickly. As winter approached, storms battered the island repeatedly. Villages already damaged by earthquakes suffered fresh destruction. Roads washed out. Food shortages worsened inland. Desperate families began migrating toward larger settlements seeking aid. Not everyone received help. Outside Knossos, temporary camps spread across hillsides where displaced villagers lived beneath rough shelters of wood and cloth. Smoke from hundreds of small fires rose into gray skis. Illness spread easily in crowded conditions. Children coughed constantly. Old people died quietly during cold nights. Terenos visited the camps several times, delivering broken pottery repaired for water storage. Each visit unsettled him more deeply. People no longer spoke like citizens of a proud empire. They spoke like survivors. One evening, he met a fisherman named Dorion sitting beside a small fire near the camp's edge. The man's face had been scarred during the tsunami. One eye remained clouded white from salt water and debris. Dorion stared toward the distant sea. It wasn't only the wave, he muttered. Terenos sat beside him silently. The ocean changed after Thera, Dorion continued. Fish disappeared from familiar waters. Currents shifted. Storms come strangely now. You think the gods caused it. Dorion shook his head slowly. I think nature doesn't care about us at all. That idea felt dangerous. In the ancient world, disasters usually demanded meaning. Gods punished wrongdoing. Spirits delivered warnings. Divine anger explained suffering. But what if catastrophe happened without purpose? What if the universe simply destroyed things because it could? Such thoughts spread quietly across Crete, like invisible cracks inside stone. The following spring brought little relief. Although some fields recovered partially, overall harvests remained poor. Trade improved only slightly. Many ports still struggled to rebuild. Worse still, pirate attacks increased across regional waters. Merchant captains vanished. Coastal villages reported raids during the night. The palace rulers responded by demanding greater labor and tribute from the population. Workers were ordered to rebuild storage facilities, roads, and sections of damaged harbors. Farmers surrendered larger portions of harvests. Craftsmen like Terenos faced new production quotas. Resentment grew rapidly. They ask more from people who already have nothing. One blacksmith complained publicly in the marketplace. A nearby official overheard him. The blacksmith disappeared 2 days later. Fear deepened further. Meanwhile, signs of outside influence became impossible to ignore. Mainland traders appeared more frequently within Knossos itself. Some served as mercenaries hired to protect shipping routes. Others acted as allies, offering military assistance. Their presence changed the atmosphere of the city. The Mycenaeans dressed differently. They carried themselves differently. Minoan culture valued elegance, ritual, art, and ceremony. The mainland warriors projected hardness. Bronze swords hung openly from their belts. Their speech sounded sharper, more abrupt. Terenos disliked them immediately. One afternoon, he watched several Mycenaean guards shove aside local dockworkers during a dispute near grain shipments. The mainland soldiers laughed afterward, while the workers lowered their heads silently. That would never have happened years earlier. Crete had once been powerful enough that foreign warriors behaved carefully on the island. Now they walked the streets with growing confidence. Summer arrived hot and dry. Water shortages struck several settlements. Wells produced less than expected. Priests organized massive public ceremonies, begging divine favor. Hundreds gathered in palace courtyards, carrying offerings of wine, grain, flowers, and animals. Terenos attended one reluctantly, alongside Melina. The ritual lasted hours. Drums echoed beneath blazing sunlight, while dancers wearing elaborate masks moved around sacred altars. Bulls bellowed nervously nearby, awaiting sacrifice. Priests raised bronze blades toward the heavens, while chanting prayers older than memory itself. At the ceremony's climax, the high priestess stepped forward, wearing layered robes decorated with gold embroidery. Her voice carried across the packed courtyard. "The gods test Crete," she declared. "But those who remain faithful shall see renewal." The crowd cheered weakly, not because they fully believed her, because they desperately needed to. That night, another earthquake struck. Not catastrophic, just enough to crack walls and wake sleeping families in terror. By dawn, exhausted citizens wandered through the streets, inspecting fresh damage, while priests insisted the ritual had prevented something worse. But increasingly, people doubted everything. Doubt became especially dangerous inside the palace administration itself. Rival factions blamed one another for failures. Some officials argued resources should focus entirely on rebuilding fleets. Others prioritized food distribution. Certain nobles demanded stronger military alliances with mainland kingdoms. Whispers of betrayal circulated constantly. Melina eventually confessed something alarming to Terenos during a late evening meeting near the workshops. "The palace archives are hiding reports," she said quietly. "What reports?" She swallowed nervously. "Entire towns abandoning their loyalty. Terenos stared at her. What do you mean, abandoning? They stop sending tribute. Some local leaders now rule independently. That revelation chilled him. The strength of Minoan civilization depended heavily upon centralized palace control. The great palaces organized trade, agriculture, religion, storage, labor, and administration. If regional settlements stopped obeying, the entire system weakened, and systems this large rarely survive partial collapse for long. Days later, more troubling news arrived. A fleet from the mainland had landed peacefully at a northern harbor, supposedly to assist with security operations. Palace officials publicly welcomed them. Privately, many feared occupation. Terenos noticed ordinary citizens becoming quieter around foreign soldiers. Conversations stopped when mainland warriors passed nearby. Tavern owners served them carefully. Market disputes vanished instantly whenever armed outsiders appeared. Crete no longer felt fully Minoan. One evening, while returning from the harbor district, Terenos climbed a ridge overlooking the city. Sunset painted the damaged palace gold and crimson. From afar, Knossos still looked magnificent, beautiful even, but smoke rose from poorer districts where overcrowded refugees struggled to survive. Cracked walls scarred once proud buildings. Half-repaired docks stretched awkwardly into dark water. The illusion of permanence had shattered, and deep inside himself, Terenos finally understood something terrifying. The civilization around him might not recover. Not next year. Not ever. Far beyond the horizon, new powers were already rising, and the age of the Minoans was beginning to fade into myth. The summer heat lingered long into the evenings now, wrapping the island in heavy air that smelled of dust, salt, and smoke. Even after sunset, the streets of Knossos remained restless. Somewhere in the lower districts, a baby cried endlessly. Dogs barked at shadows. Palace guards marched through torchlit corridors, with bronze spears glinting beneath wavering flames. Nobody truly slept peacefully anymore. Terenos noticed it in people's faces first. The bakers who once sang while preparing bread now worked silently. Merchants stared anxiously toward the harbor every time unfamiliar ships appeared. Farmers arriving from inland villages looked thinner each season. Even children played differently now. Their games no longer involved festivals and dancing bulls. Instead, they pretended to survive storms, pirate attacks, and collapsing buildings. Fear had become normal, and when fear becomes normal, civilizations begin changing from the inside. One morning, Terenos walked toward the palace workshops, carrying several painted storage jars requested by administrators. The roads bustled with labor crews hauling stone for repairs. Scaffolding covered portions of outer walls damaged by repeated earthquakes. Fresh cracks appeared almost weekly despite endless rebuilding efforts. The The palace itself still projected grandeur. Red-painted columns rose proudly above courtyards, decorated with faded frescoes. Priests continued ceremonies beside sacred altars. Noble families still dressed in fine linen and jewelry. Yet, beneath the beauty lay exhaustion. Inside the storage chambers, Melina greeted him with dark circles beneath her eyes. "You heard about the southern villages?" she asked quietly. Terenos shook his head. They refused grain collectors' entry. "That's happened before. This time they killed 2 officials." He froze. Open violence against palace authority would once have been unthinkable. Melina glanced nervously toward nearby scribes before lowering her voice further. "The palace plans punishment. Military punishment." She nodded slowly. Terenos felt cold despite the heat. For generations, Minoan civilization had depended more on trade and influence than brute military control. Unlike mainland kingdoms, the Minoans rarely celebrated warfare openly in their art. Their walls displayed dancers, nature, ceremonies, sea life, and festivals. Massive fortifications common in other Bronze Age cities were strangely absent in many Minoan centers. Now that weakness showed clearly. The rulers of Crete suddenly needed force to maintain order. But force was not what their civilization had been built for. That afternoon rumors spread rapidly through the marketplace. Palace officials had hired more mainland mercenaries from Mycenaean Greece to suppress unrest inland. Some citizens welcomed the decision, believing stronger security might restore stability. Others saw it as surrender. Near a fish seller's stall, 2 old men argued loudly. "The mainlanders protect us because our own rulers cannot." One spat bitterly. The second man shook his head. "Without them, pirates would already burn the coast. And when they decide Crete belongs to them," neither answered, because everyone had already begun wondering the same thing. Days later, Terenos witnessed the growing tension firsthand. A column of Mycenaean soldiers marched through Knossos toward the southern roads, bronze armor flashing beneath sunlight. Unlike the elegant ceremonial guards of Crete, these men looked hardened by constant war. Their shields bore scars from combat. Their helmets carried horsehair crests. Long swords swung at their hips as they moved in disciplined silence. Citizens stepped aside quickly. Children stopped playing to watch them pass. An elderly woman, standing beside Terenos, muttered under her breath, "They walk like owners already." The soldiers disappeared into the hills by midday. By evening, smoke rose faintly from distant southern valleys. Nobody spoke openly about what happened there afterward, but refugees soon arrived carrying stories. Villages burned, storehouses emptied, local leaders executed publicly. The palace denied exaggerations, while insisting order had been restored. Yet the atmosphere across Crete darkened further. Many citizens began fearing both rebellion and authority at the same time. Terenos spent increasing hours near the harbor because the sea at least felt honest. Dangerous, yes. Unpredictable, certainly. But honest. The ocean did not pretend things were stable when they were not. One cloudy afternoon, he met Dorion again beside the damaged docks. The scarred fisherman repaired torn nets slowly, while gulls circled overhead. Fewer ships every month, Dorion muttered. Terenos looked across the harbor. He was right. Years earlier, the bay would have overflowed with merchant vessels from every corner of the eastern Mediterranean. Now, empty stretches of water separated the remaining ships. Several docks still lay ruined from the tsunami. Others had been converted for military use. What happened to the trade fleet from Egypt? Terenos asked. Dorion laughed bitterly. Some never came. Others found better partners. He pointed toward several mainland ships anchored farther offshore. The Mycenaeans gain, while Crete weakens. The statement lingered heavily between them. Because it was true, disaster rarely destroys power evenly. When one civilization collapses, another often rises from its ruins. As autumn approached, strange weather unsettled the island again. Sudden storms battered coastal settlements. Lightning struck dry hillsides, igniting wildfires. Ash from distant volcanic activity still occasionally drifted through upper winds, tinting sunsets blood red. Priests declared omens everywhere. Sacred birds flying in unusual patterns. Temple flames flickering strangely. Malformed livestock born in rural villages. The people listened more carefully than ever now. Rational confidence had eroded badly after years of catastrophe. Superstition filled the empty space left behind. At the palace, grand ceremonies became increasingly dramatic. Huge crowds gathered to witness rituals meant to restore divine favor. Music thundered through courtyards, while dancers leapt over charging bulls in dangerous athletic displays. Terenos attended one reluctantly with Melina. The crowd pressed tightly around the central arena beneath blazing torches. Nobles watched from elevated balconies, while priests chanted rhythmically beside altars covered in flowers and blood offerings. Then the bull entered, massive, black, wild-eyed. Young acrobats rushed forward as drums intensified. One seized the bull's horns, while another vaulted over its back in a breathtaking arc. The crowd gasped and cheered. For a moment, watching the impossible grace of the performance, Terenos almost remembered what Crete had once felt like. Proud, confident, alive. Then disaster struck. The bull twisted suddenly before the final leap. One performer slipped. The animal's horn pierced directly through his chest. The arena erupted into screams. Blood splashed across stone, while priests rushed forward frantically. The dying acrobat convulsed briefly before lying still beneath torchlight. Silence spread slowly across the crowd, Some whispered that the gods had rejected the ceremony. Others believed it was a warning. Terenos simply stared at the dead young man and realized something awful. Even their celebrations had become haunted. That winter proved especially cruel. Food shortages worsened sharply in several regions. Refugee camps expanded outside major settlements. Theft increased. So did violence. Palace patrols arrested people almost daily now. Public punishments became more common in an attempt to maintain order. One freezing night, Terenos awoke to shouting outside his workshop. He stepped into the darkness and saw neighbors gathering near the street. A grain warehouse had been attacked, not by outsiders, by starving citizens. Several guards lay injured, while desperate families carried stolen sacks into the night. Mothers clutched children while running through narrow alleys. Palace soldiers chased them with torches and spears. The scene horrified him. This was no foreign invasion. This was a civilization beginning to consume itself. The next morning, public executions took place near the marketplace. 3 captured thieves were displayed before a crowd, while officials warned against future unrest. People watched silently, not angry, not even shocked anymore, just tired, very tired. Weeks later, Melina arrived at Terenos' workshop, trembling visibly. "They're moving records," she whispered urgently. "What kind of records?" "The oldest ones, trade archives, religious tablets, royal inventories." "Why?" She looked toward the doorway nervously. "They think Knossos may not remain safe." Those words hit harder than any earthquake. Knossos had stood for centuries as the beating heart of Minoan civilization. If even palace officials feared abandoning it, then the crisis had reached unimaginable depths. That evening, Terenos climbed again to the ridge overlooking the city. Cold wind swept across the hills. Below him, torchlight flickered through winding streets, while the palace glowed faintly against darkness. From afar, the city still looked eternal, but he knew better now. He had seen the empty granaries, the frightened priests, the foreign soldiers, the starving refugees, the violence, and perhaps most dangerous of all, the loss of belief, because civilizations survive earthquakes. They survive storms. They even survive famine, sometimes. But once people stop believing their world will continue, collapse accelerates frighteningly fast. Far across the sea, mainland powers continued growing stronger. Mycenaean rulers expanded trade networks aggressively. Their warriors gained confidence with each passing season. They watched Crete carefully like wolves, circling an injured animal. And on the island itself, another danger slowly approached. Not from the sea, not from volcanoes, but from within the palace walls themselves. Because in the shadows of Knossos, ambitious men had already begun planning for the world that would come after the fall of the Minoans. Winter rain hammered the rooftops of Knossos for days without stopping. Water poured through damaged gutters and collected in cracked courtyards where painted stone had once shined beneath festival lanterns. The palace servants moved constantly with buckets and cloths, trying to contain leaks spreading through the old structure. But everyone understood the truth now. The palace was no longer being preserved. It was being held together. Terenos felt it each time he walked the corridors delivering pottery. The great halls still carried the scent of incense and olive oil, yet something invisible had changed. Officials spoke more sharply. Guards watched people more closely. Even the murals along the walls seemed haunted now, their painted dancers frozen forever inside a happier age that no longer existed. And somewhere beneath the routines of daily life, fear kept growing. Not sudden fear, not the kind born from earthquakes or towering waves. This was slower, heavier, the fear of watching a world quietly decay, while pretending everything remained under control. One stormy evening, Melina arrived at his workshop, soaked from rain, breathing hard, as if she had hurried through half the city. They've started removing treasures from the lower storage chambers, she whispered. Terenos looked up from the clay bowl he had been shaping. What treasures? Gold vessels, ceremonial objects, sealed records. He wiped clay from his hands slowly. Where are they taking them? Nobody knows. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. Melina stepped closer, lowering her voice further. There are arguments inside the palace every day now. Different factions blaming each other. Some want alliances with the mainland kingdoms. Others want isolation. Some believe the gods demand greater sacrifices. And the rulers, they look terrified. That word lingered heavily in the room. Terrified, not worried, not cautious, terrified. For centuries, the rulers of Minoan civilization had projected calm authority. They organized trade across the Mediterranean. They controlled fleets, agriculture, religion, and administration. Their palaces symbolized stability itself. Now even they sensed the foundation crumbling beneath them. The next morning, the storm finally cleared. Cold sunlight spread across the city, while smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys. Terenos walked toward the marketplace and immediately noticed unusual movement near the western gates. Mainland soldiers, dozens of them, more heavily armed than previous groups. Their bronze armor gleamed sharply beneath morning light, while palace officials greeted them with forced smiles. Citizens watched from a distance in uneasy silence. A fish merchant standing nearby muttered quietly. Another security force. Nobody laughed. The Mycenaeans no longer behaved like temporary allies. They inspected docks. They questioned workers. They guarded storage facilities. Some even occupied sections of the harbor permanently. Crete remained technically independent, but independence can disappear gradually before anyone fully notices. At the market, tension simmered beneath every interaction. Prices climbed again due to shortages. Arguments broke out constantly over grain and oil. One elderly farmer accused merchants of hoarding food for palace elites. A fight nearly erupted before guards intervened. Meanwhile, whispers spread through the crowd. Another village had rebelled inland. A warehouse burned mysteriously near the southern roads. Pirates attacked a coastal settlement during the night. A priest claimed the moon had turned red as a warning from the gods. Truth and rumor blended together now, until nobody could separate them anymore. Later that afternoon, Terenos visited the harbor hopping to clear his mind beside the sea. Instead, he found fresh devastation waiting there. A merchant ship had arrived badly damaged after an attack near the Cyclades. Several sailors staggered ashore wounded and exhausted. Their captain argued furiously with harbor officials, while workers unloaded what remained of the cargo. Dorion sat nearby, repairing nets again. Pirates, Terenos asked. The fishermen spat into the water. Maybe pirates. Maybe mainland raiders pretending to be pirates. What's the difference? Dorion looked toward the Mycenaean ships anchored offshore. Not much anymore. A cold wind moved across the harbor, carrying the smell of rain and saltwater rot. Several damaged vessels creaked softly against their moorings. Years earlier, the docks would have been overflowing with confident trade fleets. Now too many ships arrived broken, or failed to arrive at all. That night, another earthquake struck, smaller than the great tremors after Thera's eruption, but violent enough to send people running into the streets screaming. Stone cracked. Roof tiles shattered. Several older buildings collapsed entirely near the lower districts. Terenos barely escaped his workshop before part of the ceiling crashed behind him. The ground rolled beneath his feet like waves. Children cried everywhere. Temple bells rang wildly across the city, while priests shouted prayers into the darkness. And then came the fires. Oil lamps overturned during the shaking, ignited several crowded neighborhoods. Wind spread flames rapidly between tightly packed buildings. Smoke climbed into the night sky, while exhausted citizens formed desperate bucket lines from public cisterns. Terenos helped fight the blaze until dawn. By morning, entire sections of the lower district lay blackened and ruined. Families wandered through ash searching for surviving possessions. Some found bodies beneath collapsed walls. Others found nothing at all. The palace issued promises of aid, but supplies were already dangerously thin. Over the following weeks, the disaster deepened existing fractures across Crete. Refugees flooded toward Knossos, seeking shelter after homes collapsed in smaller settlements. Food distribution became chaotic. Palace guards struggled to control crowds during grain deliveries. Then came the murders. At first, only rumors circulated. A tax collector found dead beside a rural road. A palace messenger disappearing entirely. A noble poisoned during a private feast. Nobody knew whether rebellion, desperation, or political rivalry caused the killings. Possibly all three. Melina grew increasingly frightened. They suspect traitors inside the palace now. She confessed one evening while helping Terenos stack finished pottery. Are there traitors? She hesitated. I think everyone suspects everyone. That answer disturbed him more than certainty would have. Trust had once held the palace system together. Administrators, priests, merchants, laborers, and rulers all depended upon cooperation. But now paranoia spread through every level of society, and paranoid governments often become dangerous. Soon afterward, palace authorities announced mandatory labor drafts for reconstruction projects and harbor defenses. Citizens protested openly for the first time in years. One protest near the grain market turned violent. Terenos arrived just as guards clashed with angry workers armed with stones and tools. Shouting echoed through the streets. A young laborer struck a guard with a hammer before being stabbed moments later. Blood spread across the stone road while people scattered in panic. The dead worker could not have been older than 17. By sunset, soldiers patrolled the entire district. Curfews followed, then arrests. The city began feeling less like a thriving capital and more like an occupied fortress. Yet, despite all this suffering, palace ceremonies continued obsessively. If anything, religion became even more elaborate. The rulers needed legitimacy desperately now, and divine authority remained their strongest weapon. Massive public rituals filled the courtyards weekly. Bulls were sacrificed in greater numbers. Priests burned incense constantly while chanting for protection and renewal. One evening, Terenos attended a torchlit ceremony, almost by accident, while delivering ceramic vessels. The atmosphere unsettled him immediately. Hundreds gathered silently around the central courtyard, while drums echoed slowly through the darkness. Priestesses dressed in layered white robes moved beside enormous braziers. Flames reflected across gold jewelry and painted columns. Then the high priest appeared carrying a bronze mask shaped like a bull's face. The crowd fell completely silent. He raised his arms toward the heavens. The old world dies because the people have forgotten reverence, he declared. Only sacrifice restores balance. A murmur spread through the audience. Terenos noticed several terrified glances exchanged nearby, because rumors had already begun circulating about darker rituals, human offerings, secret ceremonies beneath the palace. Nobody knew what was true anymore, but desperate societies often cross lines they once believed impossible. After the ceremony ended, Terenos walked home beneath cold stars, feeling deeply unsettled. The city around him no longer resembled the vibrant maritime civilization of his childhood. Fear ruled everything now. Fear of hunger, fear of invasion, fear of divine punishment, fear of one another, and beneath it all lingered another terrible realization. Crete was isolated, its fleets weakened, its economy collapsing, its authority fractured, which meant outside powers would not wait forever. The attack finally came during early spring. Not a full invasion. Not yet, but enough to change everything. A coastal settlement east of Knossos was raided before dawn by heavily armed warriors arriving from the sea. Survivors staggered inland, carrying horrifying stories. Homes burned, storehouses emptied, men slaughtered, women and children taken captive. Witnesses described the attackers wearing mainland armor. The palace denied Mycenaean involvement publicly. Privately, panic exploded through the leadership. Terenos learned this from Melina 2 nights later, when she arrived pale with exhaustion. "They're preparing evacuation plans," she whispered. "For who?" "The royal families first." He stared at her in disbelief. "And everyone else?" Melina looked away silently. That answer said enough. For the first time in his life, Terenos understood that the rulers of Knossos no longer believed they could save the civilization. Only themselves. Outside, somewhere beyond the dark hills and shattered harbors, larger forces were already moving toward Crete, and the final chapter of the Minoan world was beginning. The air over Crete changed after the coastal raid. People sensed it immediately, even before official announcements spread through Knossos. The mood inside the city shifted into something colder and more desperate. Streets emptied earlier at night. Merchants packed goods away before sunset. Families reinforced doors with wooden beams and slept beside knives, farming tools, or whatever weapons they possessed. The illusion of safety had finally died. For years, the people of Crete had convinced themselves that disasters could still be survived. Earthquakes could be repaired, harbors rebuilt, crops replanted, trade restored. But raids were different. Raids meant enemies had begun circling openly, and once neighboring powers smell weakness, history becomes merciless. Terenos noticed increased military activity almost every day now. Mycenaean warriors marched constantly through the palace district, carrying long spears and heavy shields. Supply wagons rattled through the streets, escorted by armed guards. Watchfires burned along the hills, surrounding the city each night. Yet strangely, the stronger the military presence became, the less secure people felt, because the soldiers protecting Knossos were no longer truly Minoan. One gray morning, Terenos visited the harbor again and found Dorion staring toward the sea with a face darker than usual. "They're coming in larger numbers," the fisherman muttered. Far offshore, several ships rested near the horizon. Long vessels, warships, their dark hulls cut sharply through the morning mist. "Trade ships?" Terenos asked quietly. Dorion gave a bitter laugh. "Does that look like trade?" The answer was obvious. Even at a distance, the ships carried the shape of war. Narrow, fast, built for speed and violence rather than cargo. Bronze flashed occasionally beneath sunlight as armed men moved across the decks. More mainland arrivals. More allies. The harbor workers pretended not to stare. But everyone stared. Throughout the city, rumors multiplied faster than truth itself. Some claimed the mainland kings intended to protect Crete permanently. Others believed they planned full occupation. Certain priests insisted foreign warriors had been sent by the gods to restore order. Meanwhile, refugees continued arriving from smaller settlements abandoned after raids or food shortages. Makeshift camps spread farther beyond the city walls each week. Smoke from countless cooking fires drifted across the hillsides like permanent fog. Terenos walked through the camps one afternoon delivering repaired water jars and found conditions worse than ever. Children with swollen stomachs sat silently beside exhausted mothers. Old men wrapped themselves in torn blankets against cold wind. Illness spread rapidly through crowded shelters built from scraps of wood and sailcloth. And still more people arrived daily. Near one fire pit, a farmer from eastern Crete described what happened to his village. "They came before sunrise," he whispered. "We thought they were merchants at first." "Who?" The farmer hesitated nervously. "Men speaking mainland dialects." "Pirates? I don't know anymore." That uncertainty haunted everyone now, because the line between ally, mercenary, pirate, and conqueror had blurred completely. Back inside Knossos, palace officials struggled desperately to maintain appearances. Public ceremonies continued. Festivals were announced. Musicians still performed in central courtyards, but the performances felt hollow, like actors continuing a play after realizing the theater itself is burning down. One evening, Terenos delivered ceremonial cups to the palace banquet hall and accidentally overheard an argument behind partially closed doors. "Cannot defend the northern coast indefinitely," one man snapped. Another answered sharply. "Then we negotiate." "Negotiate," a third voice shouted. "With wolves." The conversation ended abruptly when footsteps approached. Terenos hurried away before being noticed, but the words stayed with him. Negotiate. The rulers of Crete were considering surrender in all but name. That realization became even clearer weeks later, when new symbols began appearing inside palace administration chambers. Clay tablets carried unfamiliar writing styles, influenced by mainland customs. Certain Mycenaean commanders received authority over harbor operations. Small changes, but history often transforms through small changes first. The old Minoan world was slowly being overwritten. Meanwhile, nature continued attacking the island without mercy. A severe drought arrived during early summer. Streams shrank. Cisterns emptied faster than expected. Olive groves suffered beneath relentless heat, while grain harvests looked increasingly weak. Farmers prayed desperately for rain, but the skies remained cruelly clear week after week. Terenos watched arguments erupt daily near public wells. Water theft became common. So did violence. One afternoon, a fight between two families over access to a cistern ended with a man beaten to death using a stone jar. Nobody seemed shocked anymore. That frightened Terenos deeply. Civilizations do not collapse only when buildings burn. They collapse when ordinary cruelty becomes normal. Melina changed too during those months. She spoke less, smiled rarely. Dark exhaustion hollowed her face as palace administration descended deeper into chaos. Entire archives were being relocated now. She explained one evening while sitting beside Terenos outside his workshop. They're moving records to mainland ships, she whispered. Why would they do that? In case Knossos falls. The words landed heavily between them. Falls, not if disaster comes, not if conditions worsen. Falls, as though collapse had already become inevitable inside the minds of the rulers themselves. A warm wind moved through the dark streets, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant seawater. What happens to everyone else? Terenos asked quietly. Melina did not answer immediately. Finally, she whispered, I don't think they know. Days later, another earthquake struck. This one stronger. Violent shaking rolled across the island just before dawn, throwing people from beds and collapsing already weakened structures throughout the city. Terenos barely escaped his workshop as part of the outer wall crumbled into the street. Screams echoed everywhere. Dust filled the air so heavily that sunrise appeared through a gray haze. Near the palace, sections of upper corridors collapsed entirely. Several servants died beneath falling stone. Temple statues shattered across ceremonial floors. Cracks spread through storage chambers already weakened by previous tremors. And then came the panic. Not organized panic, animal panic. Crowds flooded into open spaces, fearing more collapses. Families abandoned homes. Refugees from damaged districts pushed toward the countryside, while others rushed into the city searching for aid. The palace guards lost control almost immediately. Food warehouses were looted before midday. One granary caught fire during the chaos. By evening, armed patrols moved through the streets, attempting to restore order, while smoke drifted above the ruined districts. Terenos spent the night helping injured survivors near the southern quarter. Bodies lay beneath broken beams, while exhausted workers dug through rubble searching for trapped families. At one collapsed home, they found a mother shielding 2 children beneath her body. The children survived. She did not. Nearby, priests moved through the streets chanting prayers, while carrying sacred idols wrapped in cloth. Some citizens knelt before them desperately. Others shouted accusations instead. You said the gods would protect us. Why are we still being punished? Where are the rulers now? That last question spread rapidly, because many palace elites had already begun quietly evacuating valuables and family members toward safer coastal estates or mainland strongholds. Ordinary people noticed, and once citizens realize their leaders are preparing escape routes, trust evaporates fast. 3 nights after the earthquake, riots erupted fully near the western granaries. Hungry crowds overwhelmed guards and stormed storage compounds, searching for food. Fires spread between buildings, while soldiers fought desperately to regain control. Terenos watched from a rooftop in horror, as the city seemed to tear itself apart beneath torchlight. The sounds stayed with him forever. Screaming, breaking wood, clashing bronze, crying children, and beneath it all, the terrible roar of thousands of frightened people, no longer believing tomorrow would come. By dawn, bodies covered the streets. The palace announced emergency decrees shortly afterward. Curfews expanded. Gatherings were restricted. Food distribution fell under military supervision. And most importantly, Mycenaean commanders assumed greater authority for public stability. The occupation had effectively begun, not officially, not with declarations or banners, but through exhaustion, through dependency, through collapse. The Minoan rulers still sat inside their painted halls, pretending power remained theirs. Yet, everyone could see reality changing around them. The mainland warriors controlled the docks, the granaries, the patrols, the defenses. Crete was slipping from Minoan hands piece by piece. One late evening, Melina arrived carrying a sealed clay tablet wrapped carefully in cloth. Her hands trembled. "What is that?" Terenos asked. "A record shipment list." "Why bring it here?" "Because you need to see it." He unwrapped the tablet slowly beside lamplight. The symbols listed palace treasures, religious artifacts, royal bloodlines, and administrative records scheduled for transport away from Crete. Destination: mainland strongholds. Terenos stared at the tablet in silence. The rulers were preparing, not to save the civilization, but to preserve fragments of it after its death. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the distant sea, though no rain came. And somewhere beyond the dark horizon, more ships were already sailing toward Crete. The ships arrived before dawn. From the cliffs above the harbor, they first appeared as shadows moving across dark water beneath a moon hidden behind thin clouds. Fishermen returning from night nets spotted them earliest and hurried inland, spreading alarm through the sleeping districts of Knossos. Too many ships, too heavily armed, and moving far too deliberately to be merchants. By sunrise, panic had already begun spreading through the city. Terenos woke to the sound of temple bells ringing frantically across the hills. Not ceremonial bells, warning bells. Outside his workshop, frightened citizens rushed through the streets carrying bundles of clothing, water jars, blankets, and children still half asleep. Palace guards shouted conflicting orders, while smoke from signal fires rose along the coastline. Terenos climbed toward a ridge overlooking the harbor. The sight below chilled him completely. Warships filled the bay, long rows of them, their narrow hulls cut through the water like blades, while bronze-armored warriors prepared along the decks. Spears stood upright in dense clusters. Painted shields reflected morning light. The banners snapping above the ships carried mainland symbols, unmistakable even from a distance. The Mycenaeans had come openly now. No more disguises, no more security assistance. This was conquest. Beside Terenos, an old dockworker whispered in disbelief, "The sea has finally delivered our replacement." Nobody answered him, because deep down, everyone had already sensed this moment approaching for years. The harbor defenses responded weakly. A handful of remaining Minoan vessels scrambled into position, while palace officials shouted desperate commands. But Crete's once mighty fleet no longer existed. Too many ships had been destroyed after the eruption of Santorini. Others rotted slowly in damaged docks or had been converted for trade protection. The island simply could not resist a coordinated invasion anymore. The first landing began before midday. Warriors poured ashore in organized ranks, carrying long spears and tower shields. Their armor flashed beneath sunlight, while drums echoed from the shoreline. Nearby civilians fled inland screaming as mainland troops secured the harbor district with frightening speed. Some resistance appeared briefly. Local guards fought near warehouse entrances. Dockworkers hurled stones from rooftops. A few desperate citizens attacked isolated soldiers with farming tools. It changed nothing. The Mycenaeans moved like men accustomed to war, disciplined, ruthless, efficient. By afternoon, smoke climbed above the lower harbor, where fighting still continued sporadically. Terenos watched terrified families abandon homes, while armed patrols spread steadily through nearby districts. And strangest of all, many palace officials did not resist at all. Some even greeted the invaders. That betrayal spread through the population almost instantly. "They sold us," people whispered. "They invited them." The rulers surrendered. Fear transformed rapidly into rage. Near the Western Market, riots erupted again when starving citizens attempted to seize grain supplies during the confusion. Palace guards clashed with civilians, while Mycenaean soldiers pushed deeper into the city attempting to restore order their own way, which usually meant violence. Terenos spent most of the day helping refugees escape collapsing chaos near the harbor roads. Everywhere he looked, the old world seemed to be disintegrating at once. Temple fires burning unattended, abandoned carts overturned in the streets, children crying for missing parents, nobles fleeing under military escort, while ordinary citizens fought over bread. The civilization that once dominated the Mediterranean now resembled a wounded animal tearing itself apart. By evening, the palace convened an emergency assembly. Word spread quickly that the rulers of Knossos intended to negotiate formally with the mainland commanders. Thousands gathered anxiously near the outer courtyards, hopping for answers. Torches flickered beneath darkening skies, while armed guards surrounded the entrances. Tension pressed over the crowd like a physical weight. Then the palace gates opened. A procession emerged slowly. Minoan priests, royal officials, and beside them, Mycenaean war leaders. The sight triggered immediate outrage. Some people screamed curses. Others fell silent in horror. One woman near Terenos began crying openly. The lead mainland commander stepped forward, wearing bronze armor engraved with lions. A long sword hung at his side, while palace translators prepared nearby. His voice carried cold confidence. "Crete will know stability again," he declared. The crowd erupted angrily. He continued anyway. "The mainland kingdoms offer protection, restored trade and order." A man somewhere behind Terenos shouted, "By occupying us." Guards dragged him away instantly. The commander barely reacted. "Those who cooperate will prosper." That sentence told everyone everything they needed to know. The Minoan age was ending, not with a final glorious battle, not with heroic resistance, but through exhaustion, famine, disasters, and political collapse, until stronger powers simply stepped into the ruins. Later that night, Terenos found Melina inside a nearly abandoned administrative chamber deep within the palace complex. Clay tablets lay scattered across tables, while servants hurriedly packed valuables into transport crates. "You were right," he said quietly. She looked exhausted beyond words. "They stopped trying to save Crete months ago. Then what are they doing? Saving themselves." Outside the chamber, footsteps echoed constantly through the corridors. Entire sections of the palace were already being emptied. Sacred objects disappeared into sealed containers. Royal families prepared evacuation plans under heavy guard. Melina handed him a small wrapped bundle. "What is this?" "Take it." Inside rested several clay tablets and a tiny carved sealstone decorated with dolphins. "The records of your family workshop," she explained softly. "If the archives burn, this survives." Terenos stared at the objects silently. For generations, his family had shaped pottery beneath Minoan rule. Ordinary lives woven into the fabric of the civilization itself. Now even those memories required rescuing. distant crash echoed somewhere deeper inside the palace. Both turned instinctively. Moments later came shouting, then screaming. The riots had reached the outer courtyards. Hungry citizens overwhelmed sections of the guard lines, attempting to force entry into palace storage areas, rumored to contain hidden grain reserves. Fires spread rapidly near the western halls, while smoke drifted through upper corridors. Chaos exploded everywhere at once. Servants fled carrying valuables. Priests shouted prayers. Mainland soldiers rushed toward the fighting with drawn swords. Terenos grabbed Melina's arm. "We need to leave." They pushed through crowded corridors as panic consumed the palace around them. Decorative banners burned near one stairway, while cracked walls shed dust during yet another small tremor beneath the earth. Even now, the island continued shaking. Outside, the courtyards had become a nightmare. Fighting raged beside overturned carts and burning storage sheds. Citizens armed with tools, stones, and stolen weapons battled guards beneath torchlight. Several bodies already lay motionless near the main entrance, and above all of it towered the palace itself, still beautiful, still magnificent, yet somehow already feeling ancient and doomed. As Terenos and Melina escaped toward the city streets, a terrible sound rolled across the night sky. Not thunder, a roar, deep, growing. People froze instinctively. Then came another tremor beneath their feet, stronger this time. Walls cracked loudly nearby. Somewhere inside the palace, part of an upper level collapsed completely with a deafening crash. Dust erupted into the air while terrified crowds screamed and scattered. The earth itself seemed to reject the dying kingdom. Terenos pulled Melina through narrow side streets, while panic spread across Knossos. Fires multiplied rapidly now as overturned lamps ignited homes and workshops. Smoke darkened the night sky, while mainland soldiers struggled to regain control. The city no longer resembled a capital. It resembled the end of the world. Hours later, from a hillside beyond the outer districts, Terenos finally looked back. Flames flickered across sections of the palace complex. The great halls of Knossos glowed red beneath smoke-filled skis, and for one strange moment, he understood something heartbreaking. Future generations would barely remember the truth. The palaces, the artists, the sailors, the merchants, the dancers leaping over sacred bulls. Most of it would vanish into myth. People centuries later would tell stories instead. Legends about labyrinths and monsters beneath the earth. Tales of cursed kings and heroic warriors. The real civilization would fade slowly into mystery, because collapse does not only destroy buildings, it destroys memory itself. Beside him, Melina whispered quietly, "What happens now?" Terenos stared toward the burning city. Far offshore, more mainland ships waited beneath moonlight. And somewhere inside the flames of Knossos, the old Minoan world was dying forever. The fires burned for 3 days. From the surrounding hills, the smoke rising above Knossos could be seen from miles away. A black stain spreading across the pale spring sky. Entire districts collapsed into charred ruins, while frightened refugees streamed endlessly into the countryside, carrying whatever remained of their lives on their backs. Some carried blankets, some carried children, many carried nothing at all. Terenos and Melina stayed among the hills east of the city, with hundreds of others sheltering beneath olive trees and temporary tents made from torn sailcloth. Every night, they watched the glow of the burning palace flicker against the horizon like a dying sun. And every night, more survivors arrived. Their stories blended together into one endless nightmare. My brother disappeared near the harbor. The soldiers took the grain stores. The western halls collapsed. The priests locked themselves inside the temples. No, the priests fled first. Nobody knew which stories were true anymore. Truth itself had become another casualty of collapse. During the second night, rain finally began falling softly over the hills. The refugees welcomed it at first, lifting bowls and jars toward the sky to collect fresh water. But the rain soon mixed with drifting ash from the city fires, coating everything in gray mud. Children coughed constantly. Old people shivered beneath soaked blankets. And somewhere far below, the once great capital of the Minoan civilization continued to burn. Terenos barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the palace corridors collapsing beneath smoke and screaming crowds. He remembered the murals most vividly. The dolphins, the lilies, the dancers, the bright colors that once celebrated life itself, now probably blackened beyond recognition. Near dawn on the third day, Dorion appeared among the refugee camps, carrying fishing nets bundled across his shoulders. His face looked thinner than ever. The harbor is under complete mainland control, he reported quietly while crouching beside Terenos and Melina. Knossos, Melina asked. The outer city still fights in places, but the palace, he shook his head slowly. It's finished. Finished. Such a small word for the death of centuries. Dorion stared toward the smoke-covered horizon. The mainland commanders already claimed they're restoring order. Terenos laughed bitterly. By destroying everything, they'll call it salvation. And history often works that way. Conquerors rarely describe themselves as destroyers. They call themselves protectors, restorers, liberators. Meanwhile, the people living through conquest simply try to survive long enough to see another sunrise. By midday, organized patrols of Mycenaean soldiers began moving through the countryside, searching for refugees, escaped laborers, and surviving officials. Some camps surrendered peacefully, hopping for food and protection. Others fled deeper into the hills. Fear divided everyone now. One group believed cooperation, might preserve what remained of Crete. Another believed resistance still mattered. Most people were simply exhausted beyond caring. That evening, a procession of mainland soldiers approached the refugee camp where Terenos and Melina sheltered. Their commander rode at the front, wearing bronze armor decorated with boar tusks and lion symbols. Behind him marched disciplined rows of spear carriers. No one resisted. The refugees stood silently as the soldiers entered the camp. The commander announced new decrees through translators. All displaced persons will register with mainland authorities. Food distribution will occur under military supervision. Unauthorized gatherings are forbidden. Harbor access is restricted. The words sounded orderly, reasonable even, yet every sentence carried the same hidden meaning. Your world belongs to someone else now. After the soldiers departed, arguments erupted immediately among the refugees. We should cooperate. They'll enslave us. What choice do we have? Fight. With what? Nobody possessed good answers anymore. Late that night, Melina finally confessed something she had hidden for weeks. There are rumors the royal bloodlines already escaped Crete. Terenos stared at her beside the weak campfire. When? Before the riots. So while the city burned, they were already sailing away. Anger twisted through him so sharply he could barely speak. The rulers had abandoned their people long before the final collapse even began. Perhaps they understood the civilization could not survive. Perhaps they believed preserving fragments of elite culture mattered more than saving ordinary lives. Or perhaps they were simply cowards. History rarely records such details clearly. Over the following weeks, mainland control expanded steadily across the island. Important ports fell first, then major roads, then administrative centers. Some smaller settlements resisted briefly before being crushed. Others welcomed the newcomers if food followed. That was the cruel reality of collapse. Hunger often defeats loyalty faster than armies do. Terenos eventually returned cautiously to the outskirts of Knossos, searching for surviving workshop tools and supplies. What he found instead barely resembled the city he once knew. Sections of the lower districts remained blackened ruins. Collapsed walls blocked streets. Burned carts lay abandoned beside shattered pottery and scattered bones. The smell lingered worst of all. Smoke, rotting food, death, and beneath it, the strange damp scent of wet ash after rain. The palace still stood partially intact, but only barely. Entire upper levels had collapsed during the fires and earthquakes. Several ceremonial halls were destroyed completely. Scorch marks blackened once brilliant frescoes, while broken columns leaned dangerously inside ruined courtyards. Mainland guards patrolled everywhere now. One stopped Terenos near the old marketplace. State your purpose. The accent sounded harsh, and unfamiliar compared to the flowing rhythms of Crete. I'm retrieving tools from my workshop. The guard studied him briefly before shrugging. Be quick. That simple interaction unsettled Terenos deeply. This had once been his city. Now he needed permission from foreigners to walk its streets. Inside the pottery district, devastation spread block after block. Several kilns had exploded during the fires. Workshops collapsed inward beneath burned beams. Finished ceramics lay shattered across the roads like broken seashells. Terenos eventually found his own workshop still standing partially. The one side had collapsed entirely during the earthquake. He stepped carefully through debris and ash. The wheel remained, overturned in the corner. Clay jars cracked from heat lined the walls, and beneath fallen timber rested the body of his elderly neighbor, a sculptor named Pylos. Terenos froze silently. Pylos had carved small religious figures from stone for nearly 40 years. He used to complain constantly about stiff hands and rising clay prices. During festivals, he played reed flutes badly while children laughed. Now dust covered him completely. Another ordinary life, swallowed by history. Terenos buried him that evening beside an olive grove overlooking the sea. No priests attended. No ceremonies followed. Just wind moving softly through the trees. As weeks became months, the transformation of Crete accelerated. Mainland rulers reorganized trade routes and administrative systems. Mycenaean symbols appeared on official buildings. Their dialect spread gradually through the marketplaces and docks. Some Minoan customs survived. Others disappeared quickly. The old religious ceremonies became smaller each season. Certain temples were abandoned entirely after earthquakes damaged them beyond repair. Artists stopped painting the elegant marine scenes once famous across the Mediterranean. Warriors became more respected now than sailors or craftsmen. Even clothing styles changed slowly. The civilization was not simply conquered, it was being absorbed. One afternoon, Terenos climbed again to the ridge overlooking Knossos, the same place where years earlier he first saw the distant volcanic eruption darkening the northern sky. The city below looked smaller somehow, older. The palace ruins stood beneath scaffolding where mainland workers stripped valuable materials from damaged sections. Foreign ships filled the harbor where Minoan fleets once ruled proudly. The world had shifted completely. Melina joined him, quietly carrying a small wrapped bundle. "What's that?" he asked. She opened the cloth carefully. Inside rested fragments of painted plaster recovered from the ruined palace. A dolphin, blue against white, part of an old fresco. "I couldn't leave it there," she whispered. Terenos touched the fragment gently. Such beauty, such fragility, an entire civilization reduced to broken pieces, carried in someone's hands. Below them, the sounds of construction echoed faintly through the ruined city, while smoke drifted upward from new settlements already rising among the ashes of the old world. History never leaves emptiness for long. Something always replaces what falls. But replacement is not the same as survival. And as the sun lowered across the sea, painting the ruins gold one final time, Terenos realized something deeply painful. The Minoans would not disappear suddenly. They would fade slowly, generation by generation, language changing, traditions weakening, memories turning uncertain, until eventually people remembered only fragments. A palace, a labyrinth, a king, a monster, and somewhere beneath all the myths and legends, buried under ash and time, the real civilization would sleep silently in the dark. For thousands of years, waiting for someone to uncover its story again. Years passed, not peacefully, not cleanly, but slowly enough that people almost forgot exactly when the old world had ended. The ruins of Knossos still dominated the hills above the sea, though much of the palace now stood hollow and broken beneath weathered scaffolding. Wild grasses pushed through cracked courtyards where nobles once held ceremonies beneath painted ceilings. Rainwater collected inside collapsed chambers. Birds nested among blackened columns. Yet life continued around the ruins. It always does. New houses appeared beside old rubble. Mainland administrators established military compounds near the harbor. Traders returned cautiously as shipping lanes stabilized under Mycenaean control. Markets reopened. Children laughed again in certain districts. To younger generations, the catastrophe already felt distant. That frightened Terenos more than the fires ever had, because memory dies quietly. At first, he remained in the pottery district, rebuilding what survived of his workshop. The work felt strange now. Customers preferred heavier mainland styles instead of the elegant marine patterns once beloved across Crete. Octopuses, dolphins, lilies, and flowing sea designs slowly vanished from demand. War symbols sold better. Spears, chariots, shield motifs. The island itself seemed to be changing personality. One afternoon, a mainland officer inspected several ceramic jars Terenos had finished for grain storage. "These will do," the man said bluntly, before tossing payment onto the table. No admiration for craftsmanship, no discussion of beauty, just utility. After the officer left, Terenos stared silently at the coins. Melina noticed immediately. "You hate making their designs. They feel dead. People still need food storage." "That's not what I mean." She understood anyway. The old Minoan art had celebrated movement, nature, elegance, and color. Even ordinary objects once carried joy within their designs. Now everything looked harder, sharper, made for authority instead of wonder. Outside the workshop, the The streets reflected the same transformation. Mainland dialects dominated the marketplaces more each year. Bronze-armored guards patrolled openly, while local elites increasingly adopted foreign customs to maintain status. And perhaps most painful of all, many younger Cretans adapted willingly. Why wouldn't they? They barely remembered the world before collapse. A child born after the fall of the palace would grow up thinking mainland rule was normal. The stories of the old civilization already sounded exaggerated to them, almost mythical. One evening, Terenos overheard several boys arguing near the harbor. My father says the labyrinth still exists under the palace. There was never a labyrinth. There was. A monster lived there. That's just old stories. Terenos almost interrupted. He wanted to explain that the palace itself had inspired those tales, that its endless corridors and storage chambers confused visitors so badly they imagined impossible things beneath the earth. But he stayed silent, because perhaps myth was easier than truth. The real story held no monsters, only earthquakes, hunger, fear, and human weakness. Meanwhile, the mainland rulers strengthened their control steadily. Crete became another important center within the growing sphere of Mycenaean Greece. Trade resumed across much of the Mediterranean, though now under different authority. Ships returned to the harbor, but they no longer belonged to the Minoans. Dorion continued fishing, despite age and worsening injuries from the tsunami years earlier. His damaged eye had grown cloudier over time, yet he still sailed almost daily. The sea remembers everything, he told Terenos one cold morning while repairing nets. What do you mean? Dorion gestured toward the water. Empires rise, palaces burn, kings disappear, the sea stays. Terenos looked across the harbor silently. Foreign banners snapped above the docks. Warships rested where graceful Minoan trade vessels once anchored proudly. And still, the waves rolled calmly against the shore, as though none of it mattered. Perhaps Dorion was right. Nature does not mourn civilizations. People do, as the years continued passing. Strange discoveries emerged among the ruins of the old palace. Workers clearing collapsed sections uncovered hidden storerooms, untouched since the fires. Clay tablets survived beneath layers of ash. Broken frescoes appeared from behind fallen walls. Some mainland officials preserved valuable objects. Others looted them openly. One afternoon, Melina secretly brought Terenos into a sealed chamber recently uncovered beneath a damaged administrative wing. The room smelled of damp earth and old smoke. Rows of clay tablets rested along cracked shelves, miraculously preserved by collapsed debris. These survived the fires, she whispered. Terenos moved carefully through the chamber. Ancient records surrounded them. Trade inventories, religious offerings, tax accounts, everyday details from a civilization already becoming legend. He touched one gently. These are their voices. Melina nodded sadly, and nobody can read half of them anymore. That realization hit deeply. Even before physical destruction, knowledge itself was disappearing. Languages shift, scripts evolve, meanings fade. The Minoans were slowly becoming strangers, even to their own descendants. Far beyond Crete, the wider Bronze Age world also trembled with instability. Rumors traveled constantly through merchants and sailors, wars between mainland kingdoms, droughts in distant lands, cities collapsing along trade routes, piracy increasing again. The age itself felt unsettled somehow, as though the entire eastern Mediterranean had entered a long period of exhaustion after centuries of prosperity. Terenos often wondered if civilizations resembled human beings more than anyone admitted. They are born, they grow powerful, they become proud, then slowly they weaken from pressures both inside and outside, until one day they realize they are mortal after all. One winter evening, decades after the eruption of Santorini first darkened the sky, Terenos climbed alone to the ruined upper courtyards of Knossos. Wind moved through broken stone passages, carrying the smell of rain and distant seawater. Moonlight illuminated fragments of surviving murals, faded almost beyond recognition. He walked slowly through the silence. Once this place had pulsed with life. Musicians, servants, priests, dancers, scribes, merchants from every corner of the known world. Now only echoes remained. In one shattered chamber, he found part of a fresco still visible beneath soot-darkened plaster. A woman holding flowers, her painted face still graceful despite centuries, beginning to erode the wall itself. Terenos stared at her for a long time. Then he realized something strange. The people who painted this never imagined they would be forgotten. No civilization ever does. The Romans would someday believe themselves eternal. So would countless kingdoms after them. Yet time eventually buries almost everyone beneath dust. A distant owl cried somewhere among the ruins. Below the palace, newer settlements flickered with torchlight. Life continued beneath foreign rule. Children born after the collapse now raised families of their own. The old Minoan language survived only in fragments among isolated villages and aging priests. History was moving on, and still legends kept growing. Travelers spoke increasingly dramatic tales about ancient Crete. Stories of a mighty king named Minos ruling from an impossible labyrinth. Tales of youths sacrificed to a monstrous bull-headed creature hidden beneath the palace. Heroic myths replacing complicated truth. Terenos hated those stories at first. They simplified everything, turned real suffering into entertainment. But eventually, he understood why myths survive. People need symbols easier to remember than reality. A monster is simpler than societal collapse, a labyrinth easier than political failure, heroes easier than frightened ordinary people trying to survive disaster. As old age crept upon him, Terenos spent more time teaching younger potters the fatting artistic styles of the old civilization. Most preferred mainland designs because they sold better. But a few listened carefully when he explained the flowing sea patterns once painted across Minoan ceramics. "Why did your people paint so many dolphins?" one apprentice asked. Terenos smiled faintly. "Because we loved the sea before we feared it." The boy considered that quietly. Outside the workshop, rain began falling softly over the city. Years earlier, such weather would have frightened everyone, reminding them of earthquakes, floods, and chaos. Now it simply sounded peaceful. Time dulls even the sharpest wounds eventually, but not entirely. Late one night, Melina arrived carrying a small oil lamp and a wrapped cloth bundle. "You should see this," she whispered. Inside the cloth rested a newly uncovered seal stone from beneath the palace ruins. Tiny figures were carved into its surface with astonishing detail. Ships sailing beneath stars. Minoan ships, graceful, confident, alive. Terenos stared silently at the image, while lamplight flickered across the ancient carving. For a moment, he could almost hear the old harbor again, the shouting merchants, the singing sailors, the endless movement of trade across bright blue seas before the sky turned black with ash, before the waves came, before fear consumed everything. And sitting there beneath the fatting light, surrounded by the ghosts of a vanished civilization, Terenos understood the cruelest truth of all. The fall of the Minoans had not happened in a single night. It had happened slowly. One tremor, one hunger, one betrayal, one forgotten memory at a time. Old age arrived quietly for Terenos, not through one dramatic moment, but through small betrayals of the body. His hands stiffened during cold mornings. His back ached after long hours at the pottery wheel. Climbing the hills above Knossos took longer each season, yet his memories remained painfully sharp, sometimes too sharp, especially at night. Certain sounds still pulled him backward through time without warning. Distant thunder reminded him of the eruption across the sea. Tremors beneath the earth sent cold fear racing through his chest, even decades later. And whenever strong winds carried the scent of smoke from cooking fires, he remembered the palace burning beneath a black sky, while thousands screamed in the streets below. Meanwhile, the world kept changing around him. The mainland rulers strengthened their hold completely now. Crete had become firmly woven into the growing Mycenaean sphere. Their language dominated administration. Their warriors controlled trade routes. Their customs spread steadily through religion, architecture, and daily life. The old Minoan identity survived mostly in fragments, in songs sung quietly by fishermen, in pottery patterns painted by stubborn artisans, in half-forgotten prayers, whispered by elderly priestesses in isolated villages. Every year, more disappeared. One warm spring morning, Terenos sat outside his workshop, watching young apprentices load grain jars onto a merchant cart. The boys laughed loudly while arguing about a mainland war far north across the sea. One suddenly turned toward him. "Master Terenos," he asked, "is it true the old palace once had thousands of rooms?" "Probably more, and tunnels beneath the earth. Storage chambers mostly." The boys exchanged disappointed glances. "No monsters?" one asked hopefully. Terenos smiled faintly. "Only people." They laughed at that answer, clearly unsatisfied. After they returned to work, Terenos stared toward the distant ruins above the city. The myths had grown larger than reality now. Travelers arriving from foreign ports spoke excitedly about ancient Crete, as though it belonged to a dream world rather than history. Poets exaggerated every story. Sailors invented impossible details after too much wine. A giant labyrinth, a monstrous Minotaur, heroic princes, cursed kings. The truth slowly vanished beneath layers of legend. And perhaps that was inevitable, because the real collapse was complicated. No single villain caused it. No heroic battle could have prevented it. The civilization died from many wounds bleeding together at once. Nature struck first, then fear, then hunger, then politics, then outside powers. Civilizations rarely fall for only one reason. They unravel, one thread at a time. That summer, strange news spread through the harbor again. Merchants arriving from the eastern Mediterranean described growing instability everywhere. Cities fighting cities, trade routes failing, crop shortages across distant kingdoms, entire coastal settlements abandoned. Dorion listened carefully to every rumor while repairing nets beside the docks. "The whole world feels weaker lately," he muttered one evening. Terenos sat beside him, watching sunset burn across calm waters. "You think another war is coming?" Dorion shrugged slowly. "Maybe the age itself is getting old." That strange sentence lingered in Terenos' thoughts long afterward. The age itself is getting old. Perhaps civilizations truly moved like seasons, flourishing for a time before inevitable decline set in. The great Bronze Age kingdoms had once seemed eternal. Now cracks spread everywhere. Years later, historians would call it the Bronze Age collapse. Entire civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East would shatter within generations. But living through, it felt different. People inside collapsing worlds rarely understand the full scale immediately. They only notice life becoming harder, more dangerous, more uncertain, until eventually they wake one morning surrounded by ruins. One autumn afternoon, Melina arrived carrying several recovered tablets from a recently excavated section beneath the old palace ruins. Age lined her face now too, though her eyes remained sharp. They found another archive chamber, she said softly. Terenos examined the clay tablets carefully. Most carried inventories, oil shipments, bronze counts, textiles, livestock records, ordinary details from ordinary days. And somehow that made them heartbreaking. These people were planning for the future, he whispered. Of course they were. A silence settled between them, because that was the cruel truth hidden beneath every ancient ruin. The people living there never knew they were the last generation. The scribes recording olive inventories did not realize their civilization stood near extinction. Merchants ordering cargo ships expected next year to arrive normally. Artists painting dolphins on palace walls imagined future audiences admiring their work forever. Nobody wakes up believing they live at the end of history. That evening, rain swept across Crete in long silver sheets, while thunder rolled over the sea. Terenos sat awake inside his workshop, listening carefully to the storm. For a moment, he almost expected another catastrophe, another eruption, another wave, another collapse. But the night passed quietly. Only rain, yet even ordinary storms still carried ghosts now. As old age deepened, Terenos began traveling less often. Instead, he spent more time teaching younger craftsmen the techniques of earlier generations. Most cared little for history itself, but a few listened with genuine fascination when he described the old palaces before destruction. Were they really painted so brightly? One apprentice asked. Brighter than you can imagine. What was the throne room like? Cool even during summer. The walls covered with griffins and red stone. Did kings truly live there? Terenos hesitated. Maybe, or maybe the palace belonged more to priests and administrators than kings. The apprentice frowned. That sounds less exciting. Terenos laughed softly. Yes, reality often is. Outside, children played in narrow streets speaking dialects, increasingly shaped by mainland influence. Their songs barely resembled those from Terenos' youth anymore. The old civilization was fading, not through violence now, but through forgetting. And forgetting can erase worlds more completely than fire ever could. One winter morning, Dorion failed to appear at the harbor. By evening, people began searching. They found his small fishing boat drifting empty beyond the bay the following day. No body, only tangled nets moving gently beneath gray waves. Terenos stood silently on the shoreline, watching the sea carry the abandoned vessel back toward harbor. The sea finally kept him. Someone whispered nearby. Perhaps, or perhaps Dorion, simply became part of the waters he had spent his entire life studying. His death affected Terenos deeply. Another witness gone, another living memory of the old world disappearing forever. At Dorion's small burial ceremony, only a handful attended. Fishermen poured wine into the sea, while gulls circled overhead beneath cold skies. No grand speeches followed, just silence. Afterward, Terenos climbed alone to the palace ruins again. The wind blowing through broken corridors sounded almost like distant voices now. Grass covered many collapsed courtyards completely. Earthquakes and weather continued wearing down the remaining structures year after year, nature reclaiming stone patiently. Inside one surviving chamber, Terenos found faded traces of painted dolphins still visible along a damaged wall, blue shapes swimming eternally through cracked plaster. He reached out gently toward them. Once, these halls had represented the center of one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth, a maritime power connecting distant worlds through trade, art, engineering, and culture. Now owls nested in the rafters, and someday even these ruins would disappear beneath dust and soil. The thought should have saddened him completely. Strangely, it did not, because by now Terenos understood something about history. Nothing lasts forever. Not palaces, not empires, not languages, not even memory. Human beings build magnificent worlds believing permanence is possible. Yet time eventually humbles everything. And still, people continue building anyway. Perhaps that stubbornness itself was beautiful. As sunset spread gold across the ruined palace walls, Terenos sat quietly among the stones, while cold wind moved through the hills of Crete. Far below, the newer city carried on with ordinary life. Merchants bargained, children laughed, ships entered the harbor beneath foreign banners. The old world had died, but life had not, and somewhere deep beneath the ruins, under layers of ash, broken stone, and forgotten centuries, the buried heart of the Minoan civilization still waited silently for distant future generations to uncover it once more. Time did what invasion and fire could not do completely. It softened everything. The edges of memory blurred first. Then names began to change. Then meanings. Terenos did not notice the shift at first because it happened around him, not inside him. The newer generations of Crete no longer spoke about the old palace with the same weight. For them, the ruins of Knossos were simply part of the landscape, old stones used as reference points, shelters for animals, places where children played games that had nothing to do with history. The past had become background, not story, not warning, just terrain. By then, Terenos rarely left his workshop. His body no longer obeyed him easily. His hands shook even when he was not working. Apprentices now handled almost everything, while he observed in silence, correcting only when necessary. Sometimes he wondered if he was still a craftsman, or just a witness who had outlived his own time. One late afternoon, a group of children entered his workshop without fear or ceremony. They were chasing one another, laughing, until one of them stopped suddenly and pointed at the old clay wheel. "What is that?" the boy asked. "A wheel for shaping clay," an apprentice replied. The children stared at it as if it were an artifact rather than a tool. One of them frowned. "My grandfather says people used to make things by hand all the time." "That's what he said," another child added, "before the mainland machines came." They did not look impressed. Terenos listened quietly from the back of the room. Machines, even language, had changed now. What was once skill was becoming obsolete memory. After the children left, the apprentice turned to him. "They think your generation is ancient history," he said carefully. Terenos gave a small, tired smile. "We are becoming exactly that." Outside, the city of Crete had fully adapted to its new identity under the influence of Mycenaean Greece. Administration was standardized. Trade networks were stable again. Warfare, once terrifying and chaotic, had become organized and distant. From a certain perspective, life was better than during the collapse. But something had been lost that could not be measured in grain or security. That evening, Melina visited him again. She moved more slowly now, leaning slightly on a wooden staff. Age had reshaped her face, but her eyes still carried the same clarity. "They are building a new archive," she said. Terenos looked up. "Another one?" "Yes, larger, more organized. They want to preserve records from older cities." He frowned slightly. "Preserve them for whom?" "For future generations." A quiet pause followed. Then Terenos spoke. "Future generations will not understand us." Melina nodded. "That is always true." He gestured gently toward the shelves inside his workshop, where fragments of old pottery and seal stones still remained. "Even now, they misunderstand us." She stepped closer. "Then we teach them." Terenos looked at her for a long moment. "You think teaching will stop distortion?" "No," she admitted, "but it might slow it." Silence returned between them. Outside, wind moved through the streets, carrying the sound of distant construction and the steady rhythm of a changed world continuing without hesitation. After a while, Melina spoke again. "Do you ever think about the eruption?" Terenos did not answer immediately. He had not thought about it in a long time in a direct way. But now, as the question surfaced, the memory returned with painful clarity. The sudden trembling, the horizon turning white, the sky breaking open above the northern sea near Santorini. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "but not as an event anymore." "As what then?" "As the beginning of everything ending." Melina sat beside him. "That is how most endings feel," she said quietly. "Not dramatic, not immediate, just the first crack in something people thought was permanent." As night approached, Terenos stepped outside his workshop alone. The sky above Crete was calm now, almost gentle. Stars spread across it without interruption. No smoke, no ash, no distant thunder from volcanic memory, only silence. He walked slowly toward the edge of the town, where the land began rising toward the ruins again. Even after all these years, he still felt drawn to that place. Not out of grief anymore, but something closer to understanding. The ruins no longer felt like tragedy. They felt like evidence. He reached the lower slopes and stopped. From here, Knossos rose dimly against the night sky. Sections restored by mainland authority stood beside untouched fragments of ancient collapse. The contrast itself told a story. Past and present occupying the same space without fully merging. A civilization layered over another civilization. He sat on a stone and closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined voices again. Not ghosts, not myths, just people, talking, working, laughing, living without knowing. They would one day become symbols in stories they never wrote. When he opened his eyes, the illusion faded. Only stone remained. After a long silence, he spoke softly, not as a teacher anymore, not even as a witness, but as someone finally releasing what he had carried for most of his life. We were never meant to be remembered correctly, he said into the night. The wind did not respond. It never did. But somewhere beyond him, beyond the hills and the sea, beyond time itself, the story of the Minoans continued changing shape, carried forward not by truth, but by those who would retell it long after the last living witness was gone. And in that transformation, the civilization did not truly end. It simply became something else, something older than memory, something called legend. Time did not end the Minoan world with one final blow. It finished it the way wind finishes carving stone. Slow, patient, invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. By the final years of Terenos' life, even the ruins of Knossos had begun to feel less like a place of history and more like a place of forgetting. The newer settlements around it had expanded, reshaped, renamed. Roads bypassed the old palace entirely. Trade routes no longer referenced it. It remained only as a landmark that travelers pointed at briefly before continuing on. A place where something used to be. Terenos rarely climbed the hills anymore. His body could no longer manage the journey. Instead, he spent most days sitting near the doorway of his workshop, listening to the sounds of a world that no longer belonged to him. The younger generations spoke faster now, shorter sentences, different words, influenced heavily by the mainland culture of Mycenaean Greece. Their language carried efficiency rather than ornament. Even emotions were expressed more directly, without the layered metaphors that once defined the old island speech. Sometimes Terenos struggled to understand conversations happening just a few steps away, and he realized something quietly painful. He was becoming foreign in his own land. One afternoon, a young official arrived at his workshop carrying a sealed clay record. You are Terenos? The man asked. Yes, I have been instructed to ask you about the old palace period. Terenos looked up slowly. I am not a record. The official hesitated. We are compiling histories. The capital requires accurate accounts of early Crete. Terenos gave a faint smile. Accurate. The man nodded confidently. We want to preserve truth. Terenos leaned back slightly. That is impossible. The official frowned. Why? Because truth does not survive without interpretation, Terenos replied. And interpretation always changes what came before. A pause followed. Then the official asked carefully, Then what should we record? Terenos looked toward the distant silhouette of the ruined palace on the hills. Record fragments, he said, and admit they are fragments. The official did not seem satisfied, but he wrote it down anyway. After he left, Melina arrived shortly afterward, carrying a woven basket of supplies. She now walked with visible difficulty, but still insisted on visiting him regularly. He asked you again, she said softly. Terenos nodded. They want certainty from uncertainty. Melina sighed. They always do. Inside the workshop, dust floated through beams of light coming from the open doorway. The old pottery wheel stood still in the corner, unused for days. Apprentices now ran the workshop entirely on their own. Terenos no longer corrected them often, not because he lacked knowledge, but because the world they were building no longer needed his version of it. That realization no longer hurt as sharply as before. It simply settled, like something inevitable. Later that evening, Melina sat beside him quietly. They are building a great archive in the capital, she said again. Larger than anything before. Terenos nodded. They will lose most of it. She looked at him. Why do you say that? Because survival always destroys context, he replied. And without context, records become stories. Stories become myths. Myths become something else entirely. Melina did not argue. She had seen enough years to understand the pattern. Outside, the wind moved through the streets of Crete, carrying the smell of olive trees and distant sea salt. Life continued in ordinary rhythms, markets opening, children playing, ships arriving at port. But beneath that surface, something irreversible had already happened. The old world had stopped being lived. It only existed in echoes now. That night, Terenos could not sleep. His body ached more than usual, but it was not pain that kept him awake. It was something quieter, a sense that a final threshold was approaching, not in the world, but in him. He stepped outside into the cool air. The sky was clear. Stars stretched endlessly above Crete, unchanged by all the civilizations that had risen and fallen beneath them. He walked slowly toward the edge of the town, stopping where the land began rising toward the old ruins. For a long time, he simply stood there. Then he began climbing. Each step was slower than the last, But he continued. When he finally reached the ridge, the remains of Knossos stretched before him under moonlight, broken walls, partial reconstructions, and ancient stone swallowed by earth and time. The palace no longer looked like a center of power. It looked like a question. Terenos sat down carefully on a flat stone and let his breath settle. For a while, he said nothing. Then, very softly, as if speaking not to the ruins, but to everything that had come before and everything that would come after, he began to speak. "We thought we were eternal," he said. "The wind moved through the broken corridors below. We thought the sea belonged to us. Silence answered him. We thought the gods punished us for reasons we could understand." He exhaled slowly, but it was never that simple. His voice grew quieter. "We were just people trying to live inside a world that was always bigger than us." A long pause followed. Then he added one final line. "And when it broke, we broke with it." Below him, the ruins of the palace remained silent. No response, no memory, only stone remembering nothing. As the night deepened, Terenos lay back against the earth and looked up at the sky one last time. He did not think about survival anymore. He did not think about loss. He simply watched the stars, and somewhere between life and forgetting, the last living thread of the Minoan world slowly loosened, not in destruction, but in completion, because civilizations do not truly end when they are conquered. They end when no one alive remembers what it felt like to believe in them. Terenos did not wake the next morning as he once did. There was no sharp ending, no dramatic final breath marked by storm or collapse, only a gradual fading, like a lamp running out of oil after a long night. He remained on the ridge above Knossos for a time that no longer felt measurable. The sky shifted from night into pale dawn, and the ruins below slowly took shape again. Broken walls, scattered stones, half-restored corridors built by hands that no longer knew the full story of what they were repairing. Melina found him later that morning. She did not rush. She already understood. She sat beside him quietly, placing a hand near his. "You came here again," she said softly. Terenos did not answer immediately. His voice, when it came, was faint but steady. "I wanted to see it once more, without noise." Melina looked toward the ruins. "There is always noise now," she said. He gave a small, tired exhale that might have been a laugh in another time. "Yes," he agreed, "but not the same kind." A long silence followed. Below them, the new city of Crete continued its life. Markets opening, workers moving through streets, ships arriving at harbor under foreign authority shaped by Mycenaean Greece traditions. Everything functional, organized, controlled. But something was missing from it all. Not safety, not order, something less visible, meaning shaped by memory. Terenos finally spoke again. "They will not remember correctly," he said. Melina nodded gently. "No one ever does." He turned his head slightly toward her. That does not feel comforting. It is not meant to. Another pause. Then Terenos continued, softer now. I used to think survival was the point, he said. That if something endured long enough, it mattered. Melina listened without interruption. But now I think, he struggled briefly for breath. Now I think survival is only the beginning of forgetting. The words hung in the air. Neither of them tried to correct it, because there was nothing to correct anymore, only understanding. A wind moved across the ridge, brushing through dry grass and broken stone. Somewhere far below, a bell rang from the new administrative center, clear, structured, unfamiliar in tone compared to the old ceremonial sounds that once filled the palace courtyards. Terenos closed his eyes for a moment, and when he spoke again, it was quieter than before. Do you think they will still tell stories about us? He asked. Melina considered this carefully. Yes, she said, but not the same ones. He nodded slowly. That is what I feared. And yet, there was no anger in his voice, only acceptance. The sky brightened further as the sun rose over Crete, casting light across the ruins of Knossos. The palace no longer looked like a center of power, nor even a ruin of power. It looked like something completed, finished, used up by time. Terenos shifted slightly, as if settling into the earth itself. I can hear it sometimes, he said suddenly. Melina turned toward him. What? The old city, he whispered. Not as it was, but as it felt. He paused. Movement, water, voices, the weight of people living without knowing they would one day disappear. Melina said nothing, because there was nothing to answer. Terenos' breathing slowed. The wind passed over them again, gentle now. I think, he began, then stopped briefly. I think civilizations are like that sound. He opened his eyes one last time. You only notice it fully when it is already gone. After that, he became quiet. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly, like a final page turning in a book. No one was holding any more. Melina remained beside him until the sun climbed higher and the shadows of the ruins shifted across the hillside. She did not cry loudly. There was no need for that. Something older than grief settled in her instead. Understanding, the realization that she had not only witnessed a life ending, but an entire world passing through a single human memory and dissolving into time. Below them, Crete continued moving forward. Trade routes stabilized. New rulers governed. New languages replaced old ones. New children grew up believing the world had always been this way. And the Minoans, once a thriving maritime civilization of painted palaces, seaborne art, and complex trade networks, became something else entirely. Not erased, not remembered, transformed into fragments, into symbols, into stories told by people who would never know their names. As Melina finally stood to leave, she looked once more at the ruins stretching across the hillside. The palace no longer felt like a place. It felt like a memory that belonged to the earth itself now, and somewhere far beyond human understanding. Time continued doing what it always does, turning life into history, history into myth, and myth into silence. The story of the Minoan civilization did not end with fire, or war, or collapse. It ended here, in quiet forgetting, and in the gentle disappearance of the last man who remembered it as something real. Melina did not leave immediately after Terenos' silence. She stayed beside him for a long time as the sun climbed higher and the light spread across the ruins of Knossos like a slow revelation of everything that had been hidden in darkness. The world below continued without pause, but for her, time felt different now, heavier, less certain. When she finally stood, her movements were careful, almost reluctant, as if leaving the ridge meant crossing a boundary she could never return from. She looked down at Terenos one last time. His face was calm, not empty, not suffering, just finished, like something that had completed its purpose. Melina whispered softly, though she wasn't sure if he could still hear her. "I will remember." The wind carried her words away, but she spoke them anyway. She turned and began the slow descent toward the city. Each step down the hillside felt like moving away from something she could not name. Not just a person, not just a moment, but an entire layer of existence that no longer belonged to the present world. Below her, Crete was awake. The harbor was already active, with ships arriving under the authority of Mycenaean Greece control. Officials moved through structured routines. Guards stood at fixed posts. Merchants argued over prices. Children ran through narrow streets, laughing at things that had nothing to do with the past. Everything functioned. Everything continued. And yet nothing felt the same, because something essential had quietly left the island. Not suddenly, not violently, just absent. Melina reached the lower roads by midday. Dust rose gently beneath her sandals as she walked through the reorganized city. New walls had been built over old foundations. New names replaced old districts. Even the air carried a different rhythm, shaped by mainland customs and administrative order. But her mind remained on the ridge, on Terenos, on what he had said, and on what he had not needed to say. That evening, she returned to his workshop. It was still there, still standing, but quieter than before. The apprentices worked in silence when she entered. No one asked questions. No one spoke of the ridge. It was as if something unspoken had already passed through the building and settled into its walls. On the old table, she found a small clay shard. It had not been there before, or perhaps she had simply never noticed it. She picked it up carefully. A fragment of painted pottery. Blue lines, curved forms, A dolphin, even broken, it still carried movement, life frozen inside clay. Melina held it for a long time. Then she placed it back gently where it had been found, not as an object, but as a memory she could not carry alone. Outside, the city continued its rhythm. Lanterns lit one by one. Voices drifted through streets. Ships shifted in the harbor under night winds. Life had not stopped. It never does. But something within Melina had changed permanently. The next morning, word spread through the district quietly. Terenos was gone. Not announced, not marked with ceremony, just understood. Those who had known him longer did not speak much about it. There was no clear tradition left for people like him anymore. The world had moved into a different structure, more organized, less personal, more focused on survival than memory. A few apprentices visited the ridge later that day. They found only stone, no message, no monument, only the place where a man had once sat and spoken to time itself. One of them asked quietly, who was he really? No one answered immediately. Then an older worker replied, almost reluctantly, someone who remembered too much. And that was all. That was enough, because memory, in the end, is not preserved by monuments alone. It survives only as long as someone is willing to carry it. Days turned into seasons, seasons into years, and gradually, even Melina's visits to the ridge became less frequent, not because she forgot, but because the world around her demanded attention that left less space for memory. The archives expanded. The mainland administration stabilized. New generations grew up speaking differently, thinking differently, imagining the world through systems that no longer contained the emotional weight of what had been lost. And the story of the old civilization once lived, then remembered, then retold, began its final transformation into legend, into symbol, into something no longer tied to time. Far above the hills, the ruins of Knossos remained, not as a living city, not even as a complete ruin, but as a presence, a shape in the landscape that meant something had once been there, without needing to explain what. The palace no longer spoke, but it did not need to, because civilizations do not truly vanish in a single moment. They fade, they fragment, they dissolve into layers of interpretation until the original voice becomes unrecognizable, and somewhere, far beyond the reach of living memory, the last witness of the Minoan world had already finished speaking, leaving only silence, and the beginning of myth. The final transformation of the Minoan world did not happen on Crete alone. It happened in the way people far away began to speak about it. Decades passed, then generations. The ruins of Knossos remained on the island, still visible, still standing in broken layers of stone and reconstructed walls. But by then, very few people cared about what it had truly been. to the mainland world of Mycenaean Greece, it had already become something distant, an old, half-remembered chapter absorbed into broader history, then slowly reshaped into story. And stories do not preserve truth. They preserve emotion. A traveler would arrive on Crete and be told of an ancient palace, not a collapsing civilization shaped by earthquakes, famine, political breakdown, and foreign control, but a kingdom ruled by a powerful king who built an impossible structure beneath the earth, a labyrinth, a place of fear, a place of trial, a place where heroes entered and did not always return. The real Knossos had been complex, administrative, maritime, a network of trade, culture, and fragile survival. But that complexity was not what survived. What survived was simplicity sharpened into myth. A monster replaced uncertainty. A labyrinth replaced architecture. A king replaced bureaucracy. And slowly, the Minoans stopped being remembered as a people at all. They became a symbol. On the ridge above the ruins, wind continued to move through broken stone as it always had. Grass grew through ancient courtyards. Birds nested where royal chambers once stood. Rain softened the edges of carved walls year after year until sharp detail became suggestion, and suggestion became shape, and shape became imagination. Time completed what fire and war had begun. It softened everything into story. There were no witnesses left now who remembered Terenos as a living man. No one who recalled Melina standing beside him. No one who could separate what was lived from what was later told. Only fragments remained in scattered records, misunderstood tablets, and fatting oral traditions passed between generations who no longer shared the same world. And even those fragments would not last forever, because memory itself has limits. Eventually, even stories forget their origins. One evening, long after the last reliable accounts had disappeared into uncertainty, a young storyteller stood before a small gathering in a distant coastal settlement. He spoke of a lost island civilization, a great palace of impossible design, a king who ruled beneath labyrinthine corridors, and a beast said to dwell within its depths. The listeners leaned in, not for accuracy, but for meaning. The storyteller did not correct himself when details blurred. He did not need to, because by then, the story no longer belonged to history. It belonged to imagination, and imagination is far more permanent than truth. Far above that distant sea, the ruins of Knossos continued to exist without awareness, without identity, without memory of what they once were. Stone did not remember kings. Earth did not remember collapse. Wind did not remember fire. Only humans tried to remember, and humans always changed what they carried. So the Minoan civilization did not end. It transformed from palace to ruin, from ruin to fragment, from fragment to story, from story to myth, and from myth into something even older than memory itself, a legend spoken in different voices across generations who would never know the truth behind it, yet would still feel its echo whenever they heard the word labyrinth, and somewhere beyond language, beyond time, beyond the reach of any surviving record, the last shape of the Minoan world finally dissolved completely, not into destruction, but into silence that would last as long as human imagination continues to exist.